If you ask a mother when her heart first learned to split and still beat, she won't say the day she gave birth. She'll tell you it happened on some ordinary afternoon, when the world failed her child and she had to smile anyway. I am 50 years old and a cashier who knows every barcode on aisle 4 by heart. My name is Linda Parker, and I can bag groceries with one hand and catch a falling carton of eggs with the other. People think that makes me nimble. It just means I have had practice preventing disasters. Some big, most small. The biggest ones, as it turns out, have nothing to do with produce. The morning of my son's 14th birthday broke crisp and blue, the kind of April day that pretends winter never happened. I had the day off, traded with Marisol on the late shift, and spent $10 too much on helium balloons that bobbed like pink and silver moons across our narrow living room. I taped crepe paper to the archway until my shoulders ached and wrote his name, Ethan, in block letters on a banner I bought from the discount aisle. I made a sheet cake from scratch because mix cakes always taste like apology. I sliced strawberries into little hearts and pressed them along the frosting. In the quiet before he woke, I whispered, "Let today be gentle, to no one in particular." The plan was simple: family at noon, pizza at 1, cake at 2. My mother, Evelyn, had promised to bring her famous potato salad, which is mostly mayonnaise and stories about the Depression. My sister Cheryl had sworn she'd bring soda and paper plates. "We'll make it special," she'd said, the way people say "we" when they mean you. Ethan padded into the kitchen in basketball shorts and a sleep-creased cheek, taller this year, shoulders angling toward a man I can't yet see. "Morning, Mom," he said, and smiled at the balloon that had drifted down to kiss his hair. He pretended not to notice that I was already on my second pot of coffee. He's the kind of kid who senses storms and offers you an umbrella without asking questions. "MVP up," I said. "Big game today." "It's just my birthday," he shrugged, but his eyes flicked to the clock, then the window, then the hallway where I'd stacked the extra folding chairs. He is 14, too old to say he's excited out loud, young enough to hope with his whole face. By 11, the house smelled like tomato sauce and cinnamon. I set 9 pink paper cups in a row, Cheryl's favorite color. And yes, I know it was Ethan's day, not hers, but I wanted to give her less to mock. I tied the last balloon to the chair at the head of the table and paid the bounce of my anxious knee with a hand pressed flat against it. I kept hearing my mother's voice from last week. "Family first, Linda. Don't be dramatic, of course we'll come." The words stacked like napkins, useful until they got wet. Ethan hovered in the doorway the way he used to when he was little and waiting for me to say, "Okay," before he came running in from the rain. "Think Grandma will be early?" he asked, casual as a cartoon. "She'll be right on time," I said, which is a kind of prayer. At 11:30, I texted Cheryl a smiling face and a map pin. No answer. At 11:45, I called my mother, and her voicemail picked up on the third ring. "You've reached Evelyn. Leave a message." No instructions about a beep, because my mother assumes the world knows how to leave her messages, and, more importantly, that she will decide if they are worth returning. Noon came like a deadline. The pizza delivery kid arrived, all elbows and acne, and said, "Ma'am," like he was trying it on for size. He helped me carry the boxes inside and looked around as if he might find his own childhood tucked in the corners. "Happy birthday," he said to Ethan, who nodded like a man receiving condolences. We waited 15 minutes, then 30. I lined up the sodas in the fridge like soldiers, except there were fewer of them than I had planned. I told myself it was fine because we could make iced tea. I handed Ethan the first slice of pizza and watched him take a bite so careful it could have been the last piece of bread on earth. "We can start without them," I said. It was the smallest untruth I've ever told, and somehow the heaviest. By 1, our neighbors began to arrive, not for the party, because they hadn't been invited, but for the ordinary life happening all around us. Mrs. Whittaker from next door knocked with a Tupperware of deviled eggs and a bright, intrusive kindness. "Brought extras," she said, scanning the room the way mothers do when they're counting ghosts. Just in case. I told her she was a lifesaver and pretended I didn't hear the careful sympathy in her voice when she asked if she could help set out plates. Behind her, the Jenkins boys skateboarded by and yelled, "Happy birthday, E." Without stopping, like joy tossed from a passing train. 110, 120. I checked my phone again and felt the familiar twin pulse of shame and anger. A text from Cheryl blinked onto the screen at 1:23, running a smidge late. Don't be mad. A smidge, for the record, is big enough to miss a child's candles. I typed no worries because I have spent a lifetime learning to make other people comfortable inside my disappointment. Ethan pretended to be interested in the pizza crust. He has his father's face when he's trying not to feel, jaw set, light gone dim. His father, who left when Ethan was 8 and left us a trail of IOUs and a silence I have learned to mop like a spill. We can wait a little longer, Ethan said, and I nodded and took his empty plate before I noticed he hadn't eaten more than 2 bites. At 1:40, I carried the cake from the fridge, candles crooked in the frosting like a tiny picket fence. I set it on the table. The house hummed, the refrigerator clicked, somewhere a neighbor's dog barked, and I realized birthdays are not for the people who arrive, they are for the child who stands waiting. Make a wish, I said, and the room felt too big for our two voices. He closed his eyes without the performative squeeze kids use for effect. He wished in the quiet way that makes you believe God leans in for the soft requests, the ones about belonging and not about things. When he opened his eyes, the doorbell rang. For a stupid, bright moment, my heart leaped like a misguided cheerleader. I glanced at Ethan, saw the hope flare and quickly dim to something like self-protection. I opened the door to find not my mother or my sister, but Aunt Carol, my father's sister, the family outlier, wearing a denim jacket and an expression that apologized for other people's sins. Sorry I'm late, she said, stepping in with a wrapped gift that looked like she knew we'd let the tape run out. She hugged Ethan in a way that said she knows 14-year-old boys are startled by affection but need it anyway. Look at you, she said, all angles and heart. You didn't have to, I began. But I wanted to, she finished, and there it was, the difference. We cut the cake. Carol told Ethan a story about my father teaching her to ride a bike, how he ran beside her until she believed air had hands. She didn't mention that the same man forgot every birthday after he left our house, or that forgiveness is sometimes a form of amnesia you choose for survival. Ethan laughed in the place you're supposed to laugh. He is a courteous boy. At 2, when the last candle sat smoking like a tiny chimney, my phone chimed again. A photo from Cheryl, her and my mother at a new fusion brunch spot, mimosas raised, captioned family time, with 3 heart emojis, as if the punctuation could replace attendance. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Carol, noticing, reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. They're not coming, she said softly. Let's not let them ruin it. Ethan excused himself to the bathroom, and I heard the faucet run longer than it needed to. On the way back, he paused in the hallway and touched the side of the door frame like he was steadying himself for the rest of his life. When he returned, his eyes were dry and older. Mom, he said, and it wasn't a question so much as a calling. Yeah, baby? It's fine, he lied for me. 14 and already fluent. After Carol left, she stayed to wipe the counter and slipped $20 into the card when she thought I wasn't looking. The house settled into the kind of quiet that exposes every hollow. I stacked plates. I put away unpoured soda. I scraped frosting into the trash, which felt like a betrayal of sugar and effort. Outside, the balloons tugged their strings as if they were asking to be let go. I considered opening the back door and releasing them, watching them float above the roof lines like little stubborn moons, but I couldn't bring myself to send more things away. Ethan wandered into the kitchen and leaned on the doorway like a question mark. Can we save some cake for later? He asked. Of course, I said. He hesitated. Do you think Grandma forgot? I wanted to sow softness around his heart. I wanted to say something noble about busy lives and time zones that don't exist. Instead, I did the hardest, simplest thing. I told the truth his age could bear. I think sometimes people don't know how to show up the way we need them to, I said. But that doesn't mean you aren't worth showing up for. He nodded, the kind of nod that says, I hear you. But I also feel what I feel. He kissed my cheek, quick, embarrassed, and retreated to his room where a boy can stitch up a day with video games and stubborn resilience. When the sun dropped low, turning the kitchen window gold, I stood alone with the sink and a sponge and the echo of the day. I thought of every time I had covered a bill or a promise with my own small life. I thought of how often I had told myself, family first. I hadn't noticed I was saying family while handing over us. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, I sat at the table and wrote in the cheap spiral notebook I keep for groceries and prayers. I wrote the lesson I wish someone had taught me sooner. The love that counts is not the love that announces itself. It is the love that arrives with paper plates and a willing back, the love that learns your child's favorite cake and stands in your kitchen so you don't stand there alone. Today hurt because it mattered, and because it mattered, it will change something. I capped my pen and looked around our little house, at the banner leaning where the tape gave out, at the cake with its stubborn, lopsided heart of strawberries. The balloons bumped the ceiling like persistent thoughts. I let myself cry, quietly, the way mothers do when the walls are asleep, because somewhere between the last bite of pizza and the silence after the doorbell did not ring, I understood. My heart had split and it was still beating. Tomorrow I would learn what to do with the broken part. Tonight, I would learn that it could hold us both. When the dishes were rinsed and the frosting hardened into a crust too stubborn to scrape, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the silence. Ethan was in his room, his laughter replaced by the muffled blips of his video game. I told myself he was fine, that teenagers bounce back like rubber bands, but I knew better. His silence felt like a bruise. That night, after he'd fallen asleep, I opened my phone and scrolled through old messages. Dozens of Venmo requests from my family glowed back at me like unpaid traffic tickets. Need $300 for Tyler's braces. Short on rent this month, can you cover? Emergency car repair, $450 just until payday. They always ended the same way. Thanks, sis, you're the best. I told myself it was family, and family meant sacrifice. I remembered how my mother had said it after Dad left when I was 20. You're the strong one, Linda. You'll take care of us now. As if my father's absence had promoted me to provider. As if love came with a bill of sale. I grew up on those words, family first, like they were gospel. Evelyn Parker, my mother, repeated them so often it felt tattooed across my skin. She had a way of making obligation sound like love. When Cheryl needed money to open a nail salon that lasted 6 months, I gave it. When my cousin Hannah had her third baby and couldn't afford diapers, I bought them by the case. And when Evelyn wanted a new recliner because her back ached, I swiped my credit card, smiling while the balance grew heavier. Family first, she'd said, patting my hand. The pat felt like gratitude at the time. Now I realize it was closure, closing the door on any protest I might have made. Cheryl was always the shining one. My younger sister, 2 years behind me with hair that caught the sun like a promise. Teachers adored her. Boys lined up at our door. She had a way of crying pretty, with tears that slid down cheeks like movie scenes. I used to envy her for that, how she made people want to rescue her. I was the steady one. The one who worked after school at the diner, who folded laundry, who made sure the bills were paid when Dad's hours got cut. I didn't cry pretty. I didn't cry at all. I swallowed. And when you swallow long enough, people forget you have a throat. The week after Ethan's birthday, Cheryl called. Not texted. Called, which meant she wanted something big. Her voice was honey poured over gravel. Lynn, don't freak out, okay? But Savannah's wedding deposit is due this weekend. 2,000. Mom says you'll cover it since you're good with numbers. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, as if the pressure might keep the words out. Cheryl, Ethan's braces are due next month. I can't. You always say you can't, she snapped, suddenly sharp. But you do, because you know family matters. Don't make this about money, Linda. It's about love. There it was again. The alchemy my family had perfected, turning my labor into love, my money into loyalty. They acted like each check I wrote was proof I belonged, and if I stopped, maybe I'd stop belonging. That night, Ethan found me at the kitchen table, head in my hands, calculator glowing like a judgment. Mom, he said softly. He held a glass of milk, still in his pajamas. You okay? I forced a smile. Fine, sweetheart, just numbers. He hesitated, then sat across from me. His eyes, blue like mine, but clearer, searched my face. Mom, do we matter less than them? His voice cracked on the last word, a boy caught between childhood and the edge of knowing too much. I wanted to deny it, to sweep him back into a world where his worth was unquestioned. But he deserved the truth or some gentle version of it. You matter more than anything, Ethan, I said. That's why it's hard, because sometimes the people who should care for us ask us to care for them instead. He didn't respond right away. He just nodded, took a sip of milk, and left the glass half full on the table before going back to his room. I sat staring at it long after, the condensation pooling like evidence of something spilled between us. The next day, my mother left a voicemail. Her voice, brittle and commanding. Linda, don't let us down. Savannah's counting on you. We're family, and family shows up. I played it twice. Each time, the word family felt less like comfort and more like a chain. That weekend, Cheryl posted a picture of Savannah in a bridal boutique, lace spilling across the floor. Caption, can't wait for the big day. Hash family first. My name wasn't in the caption, but the expectation was written all over it. They didn't just want me to pay for the wedding. They wanted me to sponsor the illusion that we were whole, generous, unbreakable. I stared at Ethan's empty chair across from me at the dinner table, his homework spread out beside his plate, and thought, if family first means my son second, then maybe it's time to rewrite the order. And that thought, dangerous and liberating, settled inside me like the first real breath I'd taken in years. The Monday after that phone call, I woke with a weight pressing against my chest, heavier than the quilt tucked around me. I made coffee strong enough to burn, hoping it would cut through the fog in my head, but even caffeine couldn't dissolve the dread of what was waiting. My phone buzzed on the counter. One glance and my stomach dropped, a group text from my mother. Reminder, Savannah's venue deposit due Friday. Cheryl said Linda will handle it. Don't embarrass us, family first. Cheryl added a string of emojis, diamonds, champagne glasses, a bride in a veil like confetti over a demand. My thumb hovered above the screen. I wanted to throw the phone into the sink and drown it in dishwater. Instead, I placed it face down and tried to breathe. Ethan shuffled into the kitchen, his hair sticking up on one side, still soft with sleep. He grabbed a cereal box and poured too much into a bowl, half of it spilling onto the counter. Normally, I'd scold him, but that morning I didn't have the energy. You okay, Mom? He asked mid-chew. Fine, I lied, just family stuff. He looked at me with those clear blue eyes of his, the kind that seemed to see through wallpaper. Is it about money again? I froze, 14, and he already knew the pattern. He'd grown up watching me hand over 20s at family barbecues, signing checks I couldn't afford at Christmas, quietly covering emergencies that weren't ours. I thought I'd shielded him from the details, but kids don't need numbers to understand when something is unfair. He swallowed, the spoon clinking against the bowl. Do we ever come first? His question gutted me. I wanted to tell him yes, that he was my first, my only, my always. But the truth was, for too long, I'd let others stand in front of him, convincing myself it was noble sacrifice. And what had it earned him? A half-empty birthday table and a mother stretched thin. I reached across the counter and rested my hand on his. You come first, Ethan, you always have, I just haven't been good at proving it. He nodded slowly, then pulled his hand away, pretending to focus on his cereal. But the way his shoulders sank told me everything. At work that afternoon, I scanned groceries with mechanical precision. Bread, milk, eggs, beep, 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 while my mind replayed Cheryl's voice. Don't make this about money, Linda. It's about love. Love, the word tasted sour. If love meant draining every ounce of myself while they raised champagne glasses in my name, then maybe I'd been defining it wrong all along. During my lunch break, I opened my banking app. Numbers stared back at me. $3, 987, 52. Every dollar already spoken for rent, utilities, groceries, Ethan's braces next month. The braces mattered. His smile mattered. I imagined him laughing without hiding behind closed lips, the way he sometimes did when he forgot to be self-conscious. That image was worth more than any wedding deposit in the world. But still, my fingers trembled over the screen because saying no wasn't just about money. It was about shattering the script I'd been handed since childhood. Linda, the reliable one. Linda, the fixer. Linda who always says yes. I locked my phone and shoved it deep into my purse as if burying it could delay the choice. That evening, while Ethan worked on algebra at the dining table, I started chopping onions for dinner. My eyes stung, tears sliding down my cheeks, but it wasn't the onions. It was the memory of every time I'd been told family first and had believed it. The phone buzzed again, this time Cheryl calling. I almost ignored it, but Ethan looked up, curious, so I swiped to answer. Finally, she said, skipping past hello. I told Savannah you've got it covered. They're printing programs with your name on the sponsor list. Platinum tier. Can you transfer tonight? Venue strict about deadlines. Platinum, the word sliced me. They hadn't asked. They'd announced. They'd spent the money before I even had the chance to open my mouth. Cheryl, I said carefully, I can't pay for this. Silence, then laughter, sharp as broken glass. Linda, don't be ridiculous. You've always handled these things. You're the accountant of the family. I'm not the accountant of this family. I snapped before I could stop myself. My voice shook, but the words were steady. I'm a mother to Ethan, that's my job. On the other end, Cheryl's tone turned cold. So you're just going to humiliate us after everything Mom's done for you? Done for me. I nearly choked on the phrase. Memories flashed. Mom scolding me for not sending money fast enough, telling me Dad left because he couldn't handle responsibility, appointing me his replacement. Done for me? No, done to me. I won't pay it, I said, quieter this time, but firmer. The silence stretched, heavy and dangerous. Then Cheryl hissed, "You'll regret this, Linda." And the line went dead. I set the phone down, my hands trembling. Ethan looked up from his homework, sensing the storm in my chest. Mom? I forced a smile, though it felt brittle. Dinner's almost ready. But inside, something shifted. For the first time in years, I had said no. And though fear curled in my stomach, a strange new feeling sparked beneath it. A flicker of defiance, a spark of freedom. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of a war. That night, after Ethan had brushed his teeth and closed his bedroom door, I sat at the kitchen table with nothing but a lamp and the low hum of the refrigerator. The house felt too quiet, as if it were waiting for me to finally admit the truth. My phone, face down on the table, buzzed with new messages I refused to read. I already knew what they would say: guilt wrapped in obligation, commands disguised as love. I reached for my old checkbook, the one I hadn't touched in months. The cover was worn soft, corners curled from years of use. I flipped through the carbon copies of checks passed: $350 for Mom's emergency car repair, $800 for Cheryl's salon rent, $600 for a cousin's tuition deposit that I doubted ever reached a college. The ink had faded, but each number was a scar. I pressed the checkbook closed and pulled my laptop toward me. The glow of the screen lit the piles of unopened mail stacked against the wall: medical bills, utility notices, the orthodontist's payment plan. I opened my budget spreadsheet, every cell precise and color-coded, the way I'd always tried to control what life refused to. The numbers were merciless. Rent $1,025, utilities $191, groceries $400. Car payment $315. Ethan's braces $1, 200 due in 4 weeks. And savings, a ghost. If I handed over 2,000 for Savannah's wedding, there would be no braces, no safety net, no groceries past next month. Ethan's smile would stay hidden behind lips pressed tight, just like I had pressed my own life small enough to fit everyone else's demands. I leaned back, rubbing my temples. A memory clawed its way forward. My father at the kitchen table, 30 years ago. His face gray with exhaustion as Mom slid another bill across to him. "You're the head of this family," she'd said, her voice like a gavel. And the next morning he was gone. Just gone. For years she blamed him for abandoning us, and for years I believed her. But now, staring at my own dwindling numbers, I saw something I hadn't before. Maybe he didn't leave because he was weak. Maybe he left because he couldn't keep carrying the weight she piled on his shoulders. Maybe he had broken long before the door ever shut behind him. And now here I was, repeating history, except I wasn't walking out. I was drowning quietly, smile painted on, teaching my son to accept scraps and call it family. The realization hit like cold water. I had become the version of my father who stayed. And if I didn't change, Ethan would grow up believing this was love. The next morning, Cheryl's name flashed across my phone before I'd even poured coffee. I silenced it, then silenced Mom's call too. At work, I moved through the motions on autopilot, scanning groceries and offering the same small talk to customers. But inside, my chest burned. On my lunch break, I stepped outside into the parking lot. The spring air was sharp, full of pollen and gasoline. My phone buzzed again, a text from Mom. "Don't be selfish, you've always been the strong one, do what's right for the family." I typed 3 words, then deleted them, typed again, deleted, my thumb hovered, trembling. Finally, I wrote the truth. "I'm done." I didn't send it, not yet, but for the first time I had formed the words. That evening, Ethan sat on the couch, knees tucked under him, watching a rerun of some comedy he liked. The laugh track filled the room, but he wasn't laughing. His eyes flicked toward me as I folded laundry, as if checking the weather in the room. "Mom," he said suddenly, voice steady but too careful, "you don't have to keep fixing everything for them." The words startled me. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, looking older than his 14 years. "I hear stuff. I see when you send money, they never show up, but you still pay for them. And I just—" He stopped, chewing the inside of his cheek. "You don't have to." I dropped the shirt I was folding. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My son, the child I thought I was protecting from all of this, had carried the knowledge anyway. He'd seen every sacrifice, and worse, he thought it was normal. I sat beside him and took his hand. "Ethan, listen to me. You are the most important thing in my life. If I've made you feel second to anyone, that's my fault, but I promise you that changes now." He nodded, but his eyes stayed on the television, pretending. Still, I felt the faint squeeze of his fingers in mine, and I knew he believed me, maybe more than I believed myself. When he went to bed, I sat back at the kitchen table, staring at my phone until the numbers blurred. The fear of what would come if I said no tangled with the relief of imagining a life where I finally did. At some point, my thumb moved on its own. I opened Venmo, typed my mother's name in the recipient box, and entered an amount, $1. In the memo line, I wrote a single word, "Congrats." My heart pounded like I had pressed a detonator. I hovered over the blue button, the future balanced on the edge of my fingertip. For 30 years, I had been the family's safety net, the one who always caught them. But what happens when the net finally tears? The chair creaked beneath me as I straightened my back. Ethan's words echoed in my head, "You don't have to." I pressed send. And in that moment, something inside me snapped and mended all at once. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. The breaking point had come, and I was still standing. The moment I pressed send, I expected the world to collapse. The sky didn't fall. The floor didn't split open. There was no thunderclap announcing my betrayal. Just the faint, ordinary chime of Venmo confirming that my mother had received $1 from me with the memo "Congrats." The word glowed on the screen like a dare. For 30 years, I had said yes, to bills that weren't mine, to emergencies that were anything but, to promises of "we'll pay you back" that dissolved faster than sugar in coffee. And now, for the first time, I had said no, but in a language my family understood best. Money, $1 sharp as a knife. I set the phone down, my hands shaking. Across the hall, I heard Ethan humming to himself while arranging his books for school the next day. That sound, soft, unguarded, was my reward. My rebellion wasn't just for me, it was for him. The next morning, the fallout began. At 7:42 a.m., Mom's text arrived. "What is this? Are you mocking us? We asked for help, not insults." By 8:15, Cheryl chimed in. "Regal much sure, Linda. $1?" Savannah cried when she saw it. "You're heartless." By 9:00, my cousin Hannah added her piece. "We've always counted on you. Guess we know who you really are now." I put the phone face down on the break room table at work and sipped my lukewarm coffee. Each message landed like a stone, but none of them sank me. Instead, I felt something strange, a hollow opening in my chest, not from loss but from space. Space I hadn't had in decades. That afternoon, I stopped at the hardware store. The man behind the counter, stocky, with grease-stained hands, sold me 2 new locks and gave me a knowing nod. "Sometimes you gotta make sure only the right people get in," he said. By evening, a locksmith named Frank was at my front door, whistling as he unscrewed the old brass lock I'd never bothered to change since moving in. Ethan watched from the couch, curiosity on his face. "Why are we getting new locks, Mom?" "Because," I said, sliding my hand across his hair, "not everyone deserves a key to our home." Frank handed me 2 shiny new keys. They gleamed in my palm like medals earned from a war no one else had seen. My phone buzzed nonstop that night. At least 20 texts, 3 voicemails, and a flurry of notifications from Facebook, where my name was suddenly threaded through angry posts I refused to open. I silenced the device and tucked it in a drawer. The quiet that followed was profound, like turning off a machine that had been humming in the background of your life so long you forgot what silence sounded like. For dinner, Ethan and I twirled spaghetti around our forks. He slurped a noodle and grinned, sauce streaking his chin. I laughed, really laughed, and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done that without reservation. "This is good," he said, mouth full. "It is," I agreed, and I wasn't sure if he meant the spaghetti or the piece hanging between us, but both were true. Of course, peace doesn't last long when you've lived your life in service to chaos. At 8:47 that night, the doorbell rang. I peered through the peephole and my stomach tightened. There they were. My mother stood in the porch light, her arms crossed, lips pressed thin. Beside her, Cheryl held her phone up like a weapon, recording. And behind them, Savannah, in her glittering new engagement ring, glaring as if I'd ruined her future with a single dollar. "Linda Parker, open this door right now." My mother's voice boomed through the wood. Ethan appeared at my side, his eyes wide. "Is that Grandma?" "Yes," I said, my voice calm though my pulse raced. But she forgot to call first. The pounding started, fists against the doorbell ringing in rapid-fire bursts. "You can't hide from us forever," Cheryl shouted. "You think $1 is funny? You think humiliating your own family is funny?" Ethan clutched the back of my sweater, his fingers trembling. "Mom," I crouched so I was level with him. "Remember what we talked about, respect. This," I gestured toward the door, "isn't respectful, and it doesn't belong in our home." Before he could reply, red and blue lights flashed through the blinds. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, bathing our small living room in the colors of authority. Of course they had called the police. I opened the door, just a crack enough for Officer Thompson to step forward. I recognized him immediately. He'd coached Ethan's soccer team last spring. His expression was professional, but his eyes softened when they landed on my son hiding behind me. "Evening, MS Parker," he said. "We got a call about a family dispute." Behind him, my mother puffed up like a peacock. "She's refusing to return family property. She's threatening us. She's turned her back on us." I took a slow breath and opened the door wider, letting Officer Thompson inside. My hands shook, but my voice was steady. "There are no heirlooms here, no threats, just me saying no for the first time." At the kitchen table, I laid it all out for him: the texts, the emails, the Venmo requests, the screenshot of my $1 payment, years of evidence, each line an indictment. He reviewed it quietly, his brow lifting at certain points. When he finally set the phone down, he exhaled. "They're used to you taking care of everything. Now you're changing the rules. That's always hard for people to accept." He stood, thanked me for my time, and stepped back onto the porch. I watched through the peephole as he spoke to my mother and sister. Their voices rose, then faltered. Within minutes, they retreated to their cars, anger carved into their faces. My mother jabbed her finger toward the house before sliding into the passenger seat. The taillights disappeared down the street, leaving nothing but quiet. Ethan's voice, small and uncertain, broke it. "Mom, am I not important enough? Is that why they didn't come to my birthday?" The question ripped me open. I knelt, cupping his face in both hands. "No, sweetheart, you are the most important person in my world. That's exactly why I'm doing this, why I'm protecting us." He blinked, then leaned into me, his forehead resting against my shoulder. And in that moment, I knew the rebellion wasn't just about $1. It was about reclaiming every moment, every dollar, every ounce of love that should have been his all along. The night after the police lights vanished from our street, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. Every car door slamming outside made my heart jolt. Ethan fell asleep curled against the wall, clutching his pillow as if it were armor. I sat awake long past midnight, staring at the new locks Frank had installed, shining silver in the porch light. The silence was different now, not empty, but waiting. By morning, the barrage resumed. Text after text filled my phone. "You humiliated us in front of the neighbors. After everything Mom sacrificed for you, this is how you repay her? Money isn't everything, Linda, but loyalty is. You've turned into your father, selfish, cold." That last one made my stomach twist. They had always used his leaving as the ultimate betrayal, the warning of what happens when you stop caring. But now I wondered if maybe he hadn't stopped caring at all. Maybe, like me, he had finally realized he'd been carrying everyone else's burdens until he broke. I closed the messages and slid the phone across the table like it was something toxic. By noon, Aunt Carol knocked softly at the back door. She carried a casserole dish, her hands warm even through the glass. "I thought you might need a night off from cooking," she said. Her eyes swept over me, taking in the tired slump of my shoulders. "Rough week." I almost laughed. Rough didn't begin to cover it. I let her in and she set the dish on the counter. She smelled faintly of lavender, of steadiness. "They called me too," she admitted. "Wanted me to talk sense into you." "And?" I asked, bracing myself. Carol's mouth tightened. "I told them you finally grew a spine and they should be grateful it took this long." For the first time in days, I felt a laugh bubble up. "You're the only one on my side." "Not true." She tilted her head toward the window. Through the glass, I saw Mrs. Whittaker in her garden, waving gently as if she knew we were watching. A moment later, the Jenkins boy zipped by on his skateboard and shouted, "Hi, MS Parker. Hi, Ethan." "See?" Carol said softly. "You've got people who care. They just don't shout as loud as your mother." That evening, Ethan handed me a piece of paper. "Can I put this on the fridge?" he asked. It was a school project, stick figures drawn in crayon. Just two people holding hands under a yellow sun. Above them, in shaky block letters, he had written, "My family." I stared at it, throat tightening. No aunts, no grandmother, no cousins, just me and him. "Of course," I whispered. I found a magnet shaped like a sunflower and pinned it in the center of the fridge where I would see it every time I reached for milk or eggs. Ethan smiled, small but sure. For the first time in days, his shoulders weren't slumped. Later that night, after he'd gone to bed, I sorted through my desk drawer. Receipts, bills, faded birthday cards from years past. At the very bottom, I found the contract email Savannah had bragged about, the one from the hotel listing me as a platinum sponsor. They had signed it weeks ago, long before Ethan's birthday. They had known, they had chosen. The betrayal sat heavy in my chest, but then another thought slid in behind it. This time, I wasn't powerless. I typed out a sharp email to the hotel manager, attaching every piece of proof that I had never authorized the use of my name or business. I ended it with one line: "Remove my name from your materials immediately." I hit send before I could lose my nerve. When the confirmation came an hour later, my name scrubbed from every brochure, every flyer, I leaned back in my chair, breathless. At 8:30, the knock came. Harder this time, persistent. Ethan appeared at my side, wide-eyed. "They're back," he whispered. I pressed a finger to my lips and peeked through the peephole. My mother and Cheryl again, their faces pinched with fury. Savannah stood a few steps behind, arms crossed, phone glowing in her hand. "Linda," my mother shouted, "this is your last chance. Open this door." The pounding rattled the frame. I stayed where I was, my hand resting lightly on Ethan's shoulder. Inside, my son's crayon drawing glowed bright against the fridge. Outside, my family shouted and threatened. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need to answer. The locks held firm. My voice held firmer. This house was ours now. The pounding on my front door faded into the night, but its echo clung to the walls long after they left. For years, my family had been a storm that never passed, only circled back louder, demanding more. But for the first time, the locks held, and so did I. The morning after their siege, I woke to a house strangely lighter, as if silence itself had weight and someone had lifted it off our chests. Ethan padded into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His hair stuck up in a way that made him look younger, vulnerable. He glanced at the door, then at me, waiting. "They're not coming back," I assured him. "Are you sure?" I reached for the magnet on the fridge, the one holding up his crayon drawing of my family. "Yes," I said, tapping the paper, "because this is what matters, just us." He stared at it for a long moment, then nodded. The set of his jaw told me he believed me, or at least wanted to. Sometimes that's enough. By afternoon, the phone was buzzing again, but the voices were different. James, my coworker from the grocery store, texted, "If you need me to cover another shift, I've got you. Consider it a trade for all the times you helped me out." Mrs. Whittaker from next door stopped by with a tray of banana bread. She didn't pry, just set it down on the counter and said, My husband always said boundaries keep gardens alive, families too. She gave Ethan a wink, and he blushed in that way boys do when adults let them in on wisdom. And then, the biggest surprise, Aunt Carol again. She showed up at sunset, carrying a grocery bag that clinked with jars of homemade jam. She wasn't flashy about it. She just unpacked them on my counter, talking about the weather and traffic like this was any other day. But when Ethan ran off to his room, she lowered her voice. "They're furious," she said. "Your mother called me 3 times. Savannah says you've ruined her wedding." I braced myself. "And what do you think?" Carol smiled, small but fierce. "I think you finally stopped letting them use you as an ATM with a pulse. About time." Her words landed like warm stones in my hands, solid, grounding. That evening, Ethan handed me another envelope. "It's from Bethany," he said, naming a classmate who hadn't been able to make his birthday. Inside was a handmade card covered in glitter, glue, and stickers. Scrawled in bright marker, "Happy 14th birthday. Sorry I couldn't come." Tucked inside were 3 $1 bills taped carefully to a piece of notebook paper. For ice cream, the note read, "I'm saving up for bike, but I wanted you to have this." Ethan held the money like it was fragile, his face lit with something I hadn't seen in weeks, pure delight. "Mom, can we use it tomorrow?" he asked. "For actual ice cream?" I felt my throat tighten. "Of course we can." $3 from a child, offered with love, felt worth more than every demand my family had ever made. The next day, we walked to the corner ice cream shop, just the two of us. Ethan ordered mint chocolate chip, and I let myself splurge on a sundae, laughing when whipped cream stuck to my nose. A woman at the next table offered to take our picture. She caught us mid-laugh, faces close, imperfect, and unguarded. Later that night, I looked at that photo on my phone. The two of us, messy but happy. It was nothing like the polished family portraits Mom insisted on every Christmas, where smiles were strained and every pose was choreographed. This was real. This was ours. Back home, the messages from my family still poured in. Accusations, threats, pleas, but I no longer felt the same compulsion to answer. I had begun to see a different pattern, the quiet allies forming around us. Neighbors bringing food without strings, a coworker covering shifts without expectation, a classmate saving her allowance just to give Ethan 3 small bills. For so long, I believed blood was the only definition of family. Now I was beginning to understand. Family isn't who drains you. Family is who shows up when you need them, no matter how small the gesture. And though the shadows of my mother and sister still lurked outside our door, inside, something else was forming. A circle of light built not from duty but from care. It wasn't big yet, but it was growing. It started on a Sunday morning, when the house was quiet except for the sound of Ethan pouring cereal into a bowl. My phone buzzed on the counter. I almost ignored it. By now, the buzzing was nothing new, but the preview text caught my eye. "Wow, Linda, way to betray your own family. Everyone's talking about it." I unlocked the screen and felt my chest tighten. Cheryl had posted on Facebook a long, venom-laced status. "Some people pretend to care about family until they're asked to contribute. Then suddenly they're too good for the rest of us. Sad when money means more than memories. We see your true colors now." My name wasn't mentioned outright, but she tagged me in the comments. 17 replies already, mostly from extended relatives and high school friends I hadn't spoken to in years. "So sorry you're dealing with this, hun. Blood should come first, always. Family doesn't owe you everything, but loyalty is everything." Each comment was a needle, sharp and casual. None of them asked for my side. None of them wondered why I might have sent $1 instead of 2,000. The narrative had already been written. Linda, the selfish one. Linda, the cold one. Ethan walked into the kitchen, crunching loudly, oblivious. I locked my phone and forced a smile. "Homework done?" "Almost," he said, milk dribbling down his chin. He was 14, on the cusp of manhood, and yet in that moment he was still just my boy. And I thought, he cannot see this. He cannot carry this weight. But of course, the weight was mine to bear. At work that afternoon, between scanning barcodes and bagging groceries, I stole glances at my phone. More comments piled up. Old family friends I hadn't spoken to since Dad left chimed in. "Your poor mother, after all she's done." Others, strangers to me, offered sympathy to Cheryl and Savannah for being saddled with such an ungrateful sister. I typed paragraphs in my head about the $40,000 I'd given them over the years, about the birthdays and graduations they'd skipped, about how Ethan cried at night when he thought I couldn't hear. I rehearsed sentences like weapons. This isn't about money. This is about respect. This is about a child who deserves better than broken promises. But every time my thumbs hovered over the keyboard, I stopped. Because here's what I realized: you cannot win a war in the comments section. The people who believe lies will cling to them no matter how many receipts you show. And the people who truly love you don't need proof, they already know. That night, I sat at the table long after Ethan had gone to bed. The glow of the phone lit my hands as I opened Facebook. My heart pounded, my throat ached with unshed words. In the comment box, I didn't paste the evidence. I didn't attach the spreadsheets. I didn't unearth 30 years of unpaid debts. Instead, I typed 5 words: "I wish you all well," and I pressed post. The silence that followed was deafening. No arguments, no explanations, no defenses, just a line in the sand. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I felt still. Across the hall, Ethan stirred in his sleep, mumbling something about a science project. I smiled to myself. My son's life was too big, too full of possibility, to let it be dimmed by the shadows of people who only took. The next morning, Carol called. "Saw your post," she said, voice proud. "Simple, classy, they'll hate it." "Good," I said, surprising myself with the steel in my tone. Later, Mrs. Whittaker dropped off another tray of food, chicken casserole this time. She gave me a knowing look. "Social media can be poison," she murmured, "but truth has a way of outlasting noise." And as I closed the door, I realized she was right. For the first time in decades, I wasn't scrambling to explain myself. I wasn't begging to be understood. I was simply standing. And that, in itself, felt like victory. The following week, the house was calmer, but my chest wasn't. I'd posted my 5-word farewell on Facebook, but the ripple effects kept coming. Angry voicemails from Mom, texts from Cheryl laced with sarcasm, cousins I barely knew suddenly playing jury in a trial I hadn't asked for. And yet, underneath the noise, something steady had begun to grow inside me. A realization: if I didn't put the truth on paper, undeniable, written, permanent, then they'd keep rewriting the story until I barely recognized myself in it. So one night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of stale coffee and opened my laptop. The cursor blinked at me, patient, like it was waiting for courage. I began with numbers, cold, unarguable numbers. $650 for Cheryl's rent, $200 for Savannah's business investment, $800 for Mom's emergency dental work, $350 for new patio furniture, $840 for Christmas gifts for the entire family. Line after line, year after year. 3 years of Venmo transfers, checks, cash withdrawals, scribbled IOUs. I totaled them at the bottom, $23,470. The number stared back at me like a mirror. Enough for a used car. Enough for braces, plus college savings. Enough for Ethan to feel secure instead of small. But this wasn't just about money. It was about every missed birthday, every graduation skipped, every time my son had stood at a window waiting for faces that never appeared. So after the numbers, I wrote the words. This is not about money. This is about respect, about boundaries, about a child who deserves to grow up believing he matters more than brunches and excuses. I wrote until my fingers cramped, until my eyes blurred. When I finished, it wasn't a rant. It was a record, a history, one they couldn't twist or edit or reduce to gossip. I printed 4 copies, one for my mother, one for Cheryl, one for Savannah, and one for Pastor Wallace, who'd been pulled into the drama by my mother's selective storytelling. I slipped each into an envelope, my handwriting firm on the front. The final sentence took 3 tries to get right. "If you want a relationship with me, or with Ethan, it will be on these terms. Boundaries are not optional. They are the only path forward." I signed it, slid the papers into envelopes, and sealed them shut with a press of my palm. It felt like sealing a door, one I might never open again. 2 days later, I stood in line at the post office, Ethan beside me with a comic book in hand. When the clerk stamped each envelope and slid them into the bin, my stomach clenched. Ethan looked up at me. What was that? Just some letters, I said. Some things that needed to be said. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded, as if he sensed that the weight I'd been carrying was shifting. That night, I tucked him into bed. On his nightstand sat the glittered birthday card from Bethany with its 3 taped dollar bills. He'd saved one of them, folded neatly inside. Mom, he said, voice soft. Does it mean they don't love us, Grandma and Aunt Cheryl? I paused, choosing each word with care. I think it means they don't know how to love us the way we need, and that's not your fault or mine. He nodded, but I saw the crease between his brows linger as he drifted to sleep. Alone at the kitchen table, I stared at the empty envelope's box. I had expected to feel guilt. Instead, I felt something new, fragile but steady, relief. For years, I'd been the family's bookkeeper, their emergency fund, their scapegoat. But now, with 4 stamped letters traveling through the postal system, the record no longer lived only in my head. It was out there, documented, real. No one could erase it this time. The boundaries had been drawn. And I knew, when the responses came, and they surely would, they wouldn't change the fact that for once, the terms were mine. When the letters left my hands at the post office, I thought the hardest part was over. But the real challenge wasn't just saying no to them, it was learning how to say yes to us. For years, my calendar had been filled with their demands. Cheryl's rent crisis, Mom's doctor appointments, Savannah's endless emergencies. Each red circle on the page was their life-consuming mine. When I finally erased them, the squares stared back empty, white, waiting. At first, the blank space scared me, but slowly it began to feel like freedom. On a rainy Thursday, I opened a savings account in Ethan's name. I deposited the first $100, my hands trembling as I typed the amount. It wasn't much, not compared to what I'd already given away over the years, but it was ours. A start, a seed. When I showed him the receipt, he looked at me wide-eyed. For college? For whatever future you dream of, I said. His smile was small but radiant, the kind that made me believe maybe, just maybe, I was rewriting his story. The house began to change too. I painted the living room a soft yellow, the kind of color that turned gray mornings bright. Ethan helped, speckling himself with streaks of paint until he looked like a human sunrise. Better than beige, he said, grinning. We bought a second-hand bookshelf from a coworker. And James, the same James who always swapped shifts without complaint, came over on a Saturday to help carry it inside. His laugh filled the house as he pretended the bookshelf weighed a ton, just to make Ethan flex his skinny arms in mock competition. It felt strange, letting someone help without owing them later. But maybe that was what real friendship looked like, giving without a tally sheet. One night, Ethan stood in front of his third-grade class for a project called My Hero. His teacher later emailed me a photo, my son, beaming, holding up a poster board with 2 stick figures hand in hand beneath a crayon sunset. Above them, in careful letters, it read, "My mom taught me that love doesn't hurt." I stared at that line until my eyes blurred. Love doesn't hurt. How many years had I told myself the opposite? That love was supposed to cost, to bleed, to bend until you broke? But here was my son, rewriting the definition I'd been too afraid to claim for myself. By fall, our days found rhythm. School drop-offs, work shifts, spaghetti dinners eaten at the kitchen table without the weight of uninvited guests pounding on the door. Saturdays at the park, just the two of us, shooting hoops until our laughter startled the birds from the trees. Carol visited often, her trunk full of jars, casseroles, and stories about my father I'd never heard. She filled in the blanks that Mom had left silent. He loved you kids, she told me once, her voice soft. He just couldn't survive the way she drained him. It hurt to hear, but it also healed, because it meant his leaving wasn't proof of my unworthiness. It was proof that even the strongest hearts have limits. One evening, I opened the fridge and saw Ethan's birthday card from Bethany still pinned in the center, glitter flaking at the edges. Next to it, I placed a photo, me and Ethan at the ice cream shop, mid-laugh, mint chocolate chip dripping down his chin. Imperfect, messy, real. As I stood there, I realized something simple but profound. For years, I had been desperate to build a family out of people who didn't want to show up. But all along, a real family had been forming quietly around us. Carol, James, Mrs. Whitaker, even the classmate who sent 3 wrinkled dollar bills. Brick by brick, moment by moment, we were building something new, something better. And for the first time in decades, I believed it would hold. As Ethan's 15th birthday approached, I felt a quiet joy humming beneath my skin. Not the frantic kind, the desperate, anxious energy of trying to impress people who would never care, but a soft, steady joy like sunlight warming the kitchen table in the early morning. This time, the celebration was simple, a picnic at the park. No expensive bounce houses, no oversized banners, no waiting at the window for people who wouldn't arrive. Just a few of Ethan's closest friends, Aunt Carol with her endless supply of homemade cookies, James with his booming laugh and borrowed grill, and Mrs. Whittaker bringing her famous apple pie wrapped in foil. Ethan didn't once ask if Grandma or Aunt Cheryl were coming. He knew, and that knowledge didn't seem to hurt anymore. When he blew out his candles, 14 plus 1, all wobbling in the wind, he grinned so wide I saw the braces glinting on his teeth. Braces I had paid for with money that once would have disappeared into someone else's crisis. Braces that were proof of every no I had finally dared to say. In the weeks after, life carried on in its ordinary rhythm, but ordinary had begun to feel extraordinary. Ethan left drawings taped to the fridge, superheroes with capes, sometimes with a little figure beside them labeled Mom. Carol visited on weekends, sometimes staying late enough that we played cards at the table until midnight. James stopped by with groceries more than once, grumbling about the buy one get one free deals he couldn't resist. Even my mailbox began to feel lighter. No more envelopes stuffed with guilt. No more demands disguised as invitations. Instead, a few Christmas cards from neighbors, Ethan's report card with a teacher's note that said, he seems more confident this year. It was as if the whole house had exhaled, relieved to finally be free of the weight pressing against its walls. One night, while washing dishes, I paused to look at the photo wall we had started in the hallway. Not the staged portraits of years past, but snapshots of life as it was now. Ethan holding an ice cream cone, laughter spilling from his face. Me, paint-streaked, standing on a ladder with a roller in hand. Carol, arms open wide mid-hug. James at the grill, spatula raised like a trophy. Mrs. Whittaker teaching Ethan how to knit, her hands guiding his. At the center, a new plaque Aunt Carol had given us, carved with simple words, our family. Not the family I was born into. The family I had chosen. The family who chose me back. Some evenings, when the house grows quiet and the only sound is Ethan's gentle breathing down the hall, I think of my mother. I wonder if she still posts her long messages, still gathers sympathy from people who never see the whole story. And then I remind myself it no longer matters. Her story is hers. Mine is mine. And Ethan's is unfolding brighter than either of us ever imagined. Family is not always blood. Sometimes family is a casserole at your doorstep, a coworker who swaps shifts, a neighbor who waves from her garden. Sometimes family is a boy with braces and a heart too big for the world, reminding you that love should never hurt. And as I close this chapter, I realize I haven't lost a family. I've built one stronger, kinder, real. Dear readers, thank you for walking beside me and Ethan through this story of struggle, sacrifice, and finally, freedom. If there's one lesson we've learned, it's this. Boundaries are not walls, they are doors that let in the right people and keep out the ones who harm us. I wish you health, peace, and a home full of laughter. May your families, whether by blood or by choice, be the kind that shows up when it matters most. With gratitude, Linda Parker.